The reptilian monster snarled, noxious drool dripping from its serrated fangs, its slitted eyes narrowing as it loomed over the terrified human girl. The Mizarian and human empires had been locked in a vicious war for decades, fighting bitterly over the precious resources of planet Zephyria. The two species despised each other. To humans, the Mizarians were a cruel and bloodthirsty race of conquerors. To Mizarians, humans were vermin to be exterminated. Alexander Crawford, a grizzled 19-year-old human soldier, was alone at his remote outpost when the blip appeared on his radar. A Mizarian ship had crashed nearby. Rifle ready, he approached with caution. The hatch hissed open, and a massive Mizarian emerged, green blood oozing from a wound. It was Yaksa, a young scientist. Alexander aimed his rifle, finger on the trigger, as Yaksa raised his clawed hands in surrender. "Please, I need help. I have information for humans," Yaksa gasped in broken English. Alexander froze. He had no idea the monsters could speak his language. His orders were clear. All Mizarians were to be shot on sight. But Yaksa claimed to have intel about a deadly new Mizarian superweapon that could wipe out all human forces on Zephyria. Against his training, Alexander lowered his gun and brought the injured Mizarian back to base, not trusting him for a second. But he had to learn about this supposed weapon. If it was real, he had a duty to protect his fellow humans, no matter the risk to himself or how much it turned his stomach to help one of these vile creatures. Failure could mean the annihilation of every human on the planet. As the two entered the outpost, the tense alliance between bitter enemies began. Neither knew that it would change the course of the war and their own lives forever. Alexander moved quickly, half dragging the limping Mizarian into the outpost's holding cell. He slammed the door shut and locked it. Yaksa collapsed on the bench, clutching his wounded side. Alexander grabbed a medkit off the wall and tossed it through the bars. "Patch yourself up," he growled. "I need you alive." As Yaksa fumbled with the bandages, Alexander hurried to the communications console and jabbed at the buttons. Static. He frowned and tried again. Nothing. The comms were down. Suspicious, he marched back to the cell. "What did you do?" he demanded. Yaksa looked up, eyes wide. "Nothing, I swear it." Alexander opened his mouth to press further, but a sudden explosion shook the outpost. Alarms blared. He sprinted to the command center and froze in horror. His fellow soldiers lay dead, consoles sparking and smoking. The outpost defenses were offline, sabotaged. Cold realization gripped him. The Mizarian had tricked him. The crash was a ruse to infiltrate the base. Enraged, Alexander charged back to the cell, rifle ready to make the alien pay. But the cell door hung open. Yaksa was gone. Alexander caught a flash of green skin outside the window. Yaksa was running, stumbling towards a Mizarian transport that had landed a short distance from the outpost. Alexander barreled out the door, firing as he ran. Laser blasts scorched the earth around Yaksa's feet, but the Mizarian managed to scramble aboard the transport. It lifted off, engines roaring. As the ship climbed away, Alexander saw Yaksa framed in a window. The Mizarian held up a device, eyes gleaming with triumph. Alexander zoomed in with his rifle scope, and his blood ran cold. It was a quantum data drive. Yaksa had stolen the outpost's database, holding critical intel on human troop locations, supply lines, battle plans. The transport accelerated and shrank to a distant speck, leaving Alexander standing alone in the smoke and flames engulfing the ruined outpost. He gritted his teeth, a cold determination settling over him. He would hunt Yaksa down. He would retrieve the stolen data. The human forces on Zephyria were depending on him, even if they didn't know it yet. He salvaged what weapons and gear he could carry from the wreckage and set off into the rugged wilderness, following the ion trail left by the Mizarian ship. He would find Yaksa, and the alien would pay for his betrayal. Alexander trekked across the rugged Zephyrian wilderness for days, following the fading ion trail through scorching deserts and jagged mountain passes. His determination never wavered, driven by the burning need to recover the stolen data and make Yaxer pay for his betrayal. The trail led him deep into the Zephyrian Canyonlands, a labyrinth of towering crimson cliffs and narrow, twisting chasms. Alexander picked his way carefully through the treacherous terrain, alert for any sign of his quarry. As he rounded a bend, he froze. Built into the sheer canyon wall was a hidden Mizarian research facility, its sleek metal exterior barely visible against the red rock. Alexander watched as Yaxer approached the entrance, flanked by 2 armed Mizarian guards. Alexander crept closer, keeping to the shadows. He strained to hear as Yaxer argued with another Mizarian who emerged from the facility. The other Mizarian, Zolara, hissed angrily, "You've gone too far, Yaxer. The data belongs to the Mizarian Empire. Hand it over now." Alexander's eyes widened. Yaxer had gone rogue. This wasn't about the war effort at all. The alien had his own agenda. Zolara lunged for Yaxer, but the scientist was too quick. He dodged Zolara's clumsy grab, then retaliated with a swift series of blows that sent the other Mizarian crumpling to the ground. Yaxer sprinted into the facility, disappearing from view. Alexander didn't hesitate. He drew his rifle and slipped inside, hugging the walls as he navigated the sterile corridors. Mizarian guards patrolled the halls, but Alexander was prepared. With ruthless efficiency, he neutralized each threat, leaving a trail of unconscious bodies in his wake. The trail of fallen guards led him to a high-tech laboratory deep within the facility. Alexander burst through the door, rifle at the ready. Yaxer spun around from the computer terminal where he'd been frantically working. The alien's eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "Wait, you don't understand," Yaxer pleaded, hands raised. "The data. It's not what you think." "All I understand is that you're a traitor and a thief," Alexander growled, advancing slowly. "Hand over the data drive, now." Yaxer shook his head. "Listen to me. The drive contains plans for a doomsday weapon, a device that could destroy entire star systems. I stole it to keep it away from the radicals in my government who would use it to—" The lab door exploded inward. Zolara stormed in, accompanied by a heavily armed strike team. "Enough talk," the Mizarian snarled. "Kill the human. Yaxer is mine." The room erupted into chaos. Laser blasts filled the air as Alexander and Yaxer dove for cover. Outnumbered and outgunned, they had no choice but to work together, returning fire against the attacking Mizarians. Alexander ducked behind an overturned table, popping up to squeeze off shots. Beside him, Yaxer fired with a stolen Mizarian blaster, his aim true despite his injuries. A stray laser bolt caught Yaxer in the shoulder. He cried out, the data drive tumbling from his grasp. It clattered to the floor, skidding under a console. Alexander lunged for it, snatching the device an instant before a hail of laser fire forced him back into cover. Pinned down, Alexander glanced at the wounded Yaxer, then at the data drive in his hand. The crossroads of destiny stretched out before him. Trust the alien who had already betrayed him once and fight their way out together? Or leave Yaxer to his fate, seize the doomsday data for himself and try to escape alone? Laser bolts sizzled past Alexander's head as he dove behind an overturned lab table, dragging Yaxer with him. The Mizarian grunted in pain, green blood oozing from his shoulder wound. Alexander popped up to return fire, downing 2 Mizarian soldiers with precise shots. "We need to get out of here," Yaxer hissed urgently. Alexander nodded, scanning the room, his eyes locked on the reactor core at the far end of the lab. "Cover me!" Alexander ordered. Yaxer leveled his blaster and laid down suppressing fire as Alexander sprinted from cover. He snatched a grenade from his belt, primed it, and hurled it at the reactor. The explosion rocked the facility, sending flames and debris flying. Alarms blared and emergency lights flashed. Using the chaos as cover, Alexander raced back to Yaxer. He slung the injured Mizarian's arm over his shoulder and half-carried, half-dragged him towards the rear of the lab. Yaxer gestured weakly at a nondescript panel on the wall. "There, service tunnels." Alexander kicked the panel open, revealing a dimly lit maintenance shaft. They stumbled into the narrow passageway, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The tunnel opened into a cavernous hangar bay. Gleaming Mizarian spacecraft sat in neat rows. "There, that transport." Yaksa pointed at a small, sleek ship. Alexander hauled Yaksa up the ramp and into the cockpit. He dumped the alien unceremoniously into the co-pilot's seat and slid into the pilot's chair. His hands flew over the unfamiliar controls, trying to make sense of the alien symbols. "Mizarian forces, closing in." Yaksa slurred, his head lolling. Alexander gritted his teeth and stabbed at a large red button. The ship thrummed to life, engines whining. He grabbed the control yoke and wrenched it back. The ship lurched off the hangar floor, hovering unsteadily. Laser blasts pinged off the hull as Mizarian soldiers poured into the hangar. Alexander punched the throttle, and the ship rocketed forward, smashing through the hangar doors and out into the crimson Zephyrian sky. As they accelerated away from the facility, Yaksa stirred. "Head north," he rasped. "The Whispering Forests. I know. A place we can hide." Alexander glanced at the alien, mistrust warring with necessity. "Why should I believe you?" "The rebels," Yaksa coughed. "They're our only chance. They can help decrypt the data, expose the plot." A warning klaxon blared. Alexander checked the sensor display and swore, Mizarian fighters closing fast. He banked hard, sending the ship hurtling towards the northern hemisphere. The Whispering Forests came into view, a vast expanse of misty emerald green. Alexander angled the ship down towards the coordinates Yaksa had provided. Suddenly, a searing beam of energy lanced up from the canopy, striking the ship's underbelly. Alarms screamed and the cockpit lights flickered. "We're hit," Alexander yelled, fighting with the controls. The ship spiraled downward, trailing smoke. They plunged through the treetops, branches scraping the viewports. With a bone-jarring impact, the ship slammed into the forest floor. Alexander's head smacked against the control panel. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision. He forced the hatch open and tumbled out, hitting the ground hard. He struggled to his feet, head pounding. A tight ring of Mizarians encircled the crash site, weapons leveled at him. Clawed hands dragged a semi-conscious Yaksa from the wreckage. A tall, heavily scarred Mizarian stepped forward, his eyes cold and merciless. "I am Razak," he growled, "leader of the Zephyrian Liberation Front. You have something that belongs to me, human." Razak held out his hand. "The data drive now." Yaksa lifted his head, eyes widening in recognition and fear. "No," he croaked. "Razak, you can't. The doomsday weapon." "Will be our salvation," Razak snarled. "With it we will finally crush the human vermin and seize our rightful place as rulers of Zephyria." Alexander's stomach turned to ice as the true scope of his mistake crashed over him. He had delivered the key to annihilation right into the hands of those who would use it without mercy. Razak and his rebels dragged Alexander and Yaksa out of the smouldering wreckage of the ship. The scarred Mizarian leader slammed Alexander to the ground, planting a clawed foot on the human's chest. "The data drive," Razak snarled. "Give it to me now, and I may let you live as a slave rather than killing you." Razak chuckled darkly. He nodded at his rebels, who hauled Alexander and Yaksa to their feet and bound their hands behind their backs. "Bring them. We'll see if some quality time in the interrogation chamber loosens their tongues." The rebels marched their prisoners through the misty forest until they reached a hidden entrance disguised by dense foliage. They descended into a sprawling underground bunker, a warren of rough-hewn tunnels and chambers. Alexander and Yaksa were shoved into a dimly lit room, shackled to metal chairs bolted to the floor. Razak circled them, his eyes glinting with malice. "I'll make this simple," he growled. "The decryption codes for the data drive, give them to me or suffer the consequences." Yaksa lifted his chin, meeting Razak's gaze unflinchingly. "I'll die before I let you access that data. The doomsday device will bring nothing but destruction to Zephyria, to Mizarians and humans alike." Yaksa spat out a glob of green blood, his split lip already swelling. "I betrayed no one. I'm trying to save us all, you fool." Razak struck him again and again. until Yaxa's face was a bruised and bloody mess. Alexander strained against his bonds, snarling with impotent fury as he watched the brutal beating. But through it all, Yaxa remained resolute, his jaw clenched, refusing to yield. Hours crept by, marked by Razak's relentless interrogation. He alternated between savage beatings and searing energy whips that left smoldering wounds on Yaxa's green hide. But no matter how much agony Razak inflicted, Yaxa held fast, his resolve unbreakable. As Alexander watched Yaxa endure the torture, he felt a grudging respect for the alien scientist growing within him. Yaxa had risked everything, betrayed his own people, all to keep this terrible weapon out of the wrong hands, and now he was willing to suffer and die to protect the decryption codes. It was a level of courage and conviction Alexander had never expected from a Mizarian. During a brief respite while Razak conferred with his lieutenants outside the chamber, Alexander noticed a flicker of movement in the shadows. A young Mizarian rebel was watching the proceedings, his eyes haunted and conflicted. When Razak left, slamming the door behind him, the young rebel approached the prisoners cautiously. "Yaxa," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me, Talon, your brother." Yaxa's swollen eyes widened. "Talon, what are you doing here? You're with these rebels?" Talon looked away, shame etched on his features. "I thought we were fighting for our people, for a better future, but this—" He gestured at Yaxa's battered form. "This isn't right. Razak's plan, the doomsday device, it will destroy everything. Mizarians, humans, all of Zephyria." "Then help us," Yaxa pleaded. "Help us escape so we can stop this madness." Talon hesitated, torn between loyalty to his brother and his cause. But before he could reply, the door burst open, and Razak stormed in, his eyes blazing with fury. "Talon," Razak roared, "I knew you were weak, but consorting with traitors and prisoners. You disgrace our cause." Talon backed away, hands raised placatingly. "Razak, please listen to reason. This path will only lead to ruin." But Razak was beyond reason. With a howl of rage, he lunged at Talon, claws extended. The two Mizarians crashed to the floor in a flurry of slashing talons and snapping jaws. Talon fought bravely, but he was no match for Razak's brute strength and battle-honed savagery. Razak soon had the younger rebel pinned, his claws poised to rip out Talon's throat. In that instant, Yaxa surged up from his chair with a desperate burst of strength. His shackles snapped and he tackled Razak, knocking him off Talon. The two combatants rolled across the floor, grappling furiously. Seizing the moment of chaos, Alexander wrenched at his own restraints until they gave way. He leapt to his feet and charged into the fray, pummeling Razak with a flurry of punches as Yaxa grappled with the rebel leader. Razak's guards burst into the room, drawn by the commotion. The chamber descended into a brutal melee, Alexander and Yaxa fighting side by side against the onslaught of rebels. Claws raked flesh and green blood splattered the walls as they battled desperately for survival and escape. Amidst the chaos, Talon reappeared, clutching a familiar device, the stolen data drive. With a shout, he tossed it to Yaxa. "Go," Talon yelled. "Get out of here, I'll hold them off." Yaxa snatched the drive from the air. Anguish and gratitude warred on his bloodied features as he looked at his brother. Then a burst of laser fire struck Talon square in the chest. The young rebel crumpled, his life extinguished in an instant. "No!" Yaxa howled, his face contorted with grief and rage. But there was no time to mourn. More rebels were pouring into the room, firing wildly. Yaxa grabbed Alexander, pulling him away from the battle. They fled, plunging into the maze of tunnels as laser bolts scorched the walls around them, and Razak's furious roar echoed in their wake. They ran, hearts pounding, deeper and deeper into the underground labyrinth, and all the while Razak's forces pursued them like a pack of hungry predators, drawing ever closer, thirsting for blood and vengeance. Laser blasts scorched the rough-hewn walls of the underground tunnels as Alexander and Yaxa sprinted through the maze, Razak's enraged shouts echoing close behind. The pursuit was relentless, the snarls of the rebel Mizarians snapping at their heels. They hit a fork, the path splitting into two gaping mouths of darkness. Alexander veered left, Yaksa right, hoping to divide Razak's forces, but the rebel leader was too clever for that, his predatory focus zeroing in on Alexander's retreating form. Alexander's boots pounded against the hard-packed earth, his heart hammering in his ears. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. Razak was closing in, his eyes glinting with murderous intent. The tunnel dead-ended abruptly, the rock face mocking Alexander's desperate bid for escape. He spun around, raising his fists, as Razak skidded to a halt mere feet away. The Mizarian's lips peeled back in a vicious grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Nowhere left to run, human," Razak rumbled. He lunged, claws slashing. Alexander ducked and weaved, his combat training taking over. He landed a solid blow to Razak's jaw, but the rebel leader barely flinched. Razak retaliated with a devastating swipe that sent Alexander flying, his rifle clattering away into the shadows. In an instant, Razak was on him, pinning him to the ground with a clawed foot on his chest. The Mizarian's fetid breath washed over Alexander's face as he leaned in close. "I'm going to enjoy this," Razak hissed, raising his claws for the killing strike. A sudden blinding flash of energy erupted from behind Razak, the force of the blast throwing the rebel leader off Alexander and into the wall with a sickening crunch. Alexander scrambled to his feet, his eyes widening as Yaksa emerged from the shadows, a stolen Mizarian energy weapon smoking in his hands. Razak staggered upright, shaking his head groggily. His eyes focused on Yaksa, and he let out a roar of pure, unbridled rage. He charged, lashing out with a flurry of slashes and bites. Alexander and Yaksa fought as one, their desperate strikes fueled by the knowledge that failure meant death. Slowly, painfully, they forced Razak back, his attacks growing more frenzied and erratic. With a final, concerted effort, they brought the rebel leader to his knees. But even in defeat, Razak's eyes burned with hatred. "You think you've won?" He spat, green blood flecking his lips. "You've doomed us all." His claws scrabbled at his belt, and Alexander's heart stopped as he saw the glint of a detonator. Razak's manic laughter filled the tunnel. "If I can't have the data, then no one can." His thumb came down on the trigger. The world exploded. Alexander felt Yaksa's hand close around his arm, yanking him towards a small side tunnel, just as a wave of fire and debris roared past. The tunnel entrance collapsed with a deafening rumble, plunging them into suffocating darkness. Coughing on the dust, Alexander fumbled for the small flashlight on his belt. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating Yaksa's battered face. The Mizarian's eyes were grim, but the data drive was still clutched tightly in his hand. "We have to keep moving," Yaksa said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "We can't let Razak's sacrifice be in vain." Alexander nodded, pushing himself to his feet. They set off into the unknown, picking their way through the rubble-strewn tunnel. Yaksa's energy weapon provided a dim, eerie light, casting long shadows on the walls. Time lost all meaning in the subterranean labyrinth. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was the other way around. Alexander's mind wandered, the adrenaline of the fight giving way to a bone-deep weariness. Just as he was about to suggest a rest, the tunnel opened up into a vast chamber. Alexander's flashlight played over the walls, revealing shelves upon shelves of ancient Mizarian artifacts and technology. Yaksa inhaled sharply. "I've heard stories of places like this," he murmured, running his claws reverently over a dust-covered console. "Repositories of our people's lost knowledge, hidden away by rebels like Razak." A glint of metal caught Alexander's eye. He crossed to a low table and picked up a small handheld device. It thrummed with power, its screen flickering to life at his touch. "Yaksa, look at this," he called out. "I think it's some kind of communicator." The Mizarian hurried over, his eyes widening as he examined the device. "You're right," he said, excitement creeping into his voice, "and it seems to be functional. We might be able to use it to send a distress signal." They huddled over the communicator. Yaxa's claws flying over the unfamiliar controls. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional crackle of static. Finally, a faint light began to blink on the device's screen. Yaxa let out a shaky laugh. "It's transmitting," he said. "The signal is weak, but if your people are monitoring this frequency—" "They'll find us," Alexander finished, allowing himself a small smile. "We just have to hold out until then." Exhaustion hit them like a physical blow as the adrenaline of the past hours finally drained away. They slumped against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, the communicator cradled between them like a fragile beacon of hope. In the stillness, Yaxa began to speak, his voice low and hesitant. He told Alexander of his life before the war, of the family he had lost and the dreams he had once held dear. In turn, Alexander found himself sharing his own story, the words pouring out of him like water from a burst dam. They talked of the horrors they had witnessed, the friends they had buried, but they also spoke of their hopes for a future beyond the bloodshed, a future where Mizarians and humans could coexist in peace. As they talked, the walls that had divided them began to crumble. In that moment they were no longer soldier and scientist, human and Mizarian. They were simply two weary souls, united by the scars they bore and the fragile bond of understanding that had begun to grow between them. A sudden scuff of movement from the far end of the chamber shattered the spell. Alexander and Yaxa leapt to their feet, weapons at the ready, as a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the tunnel. Friend or foe, they couldn't be sure, but as the figure drew closer, they steeled themselves to face whatever new challenge lay ahead together. The scrabbling of boots and claws on loose rock alerted Alexander and Yaxa to the approach. They dove behind the towering Mizarian statue, weapons clutched tight, pulses racing. Alexander leaned out, ready to unleash a hail of laser fire, but froze. The faces peering back at him, cast in stark relief by the glow of headlamps, were human. "Hold your fire!" a voice barked. A woman stepped forward, her eyes hard, rifle leveled. "Alexander Crawford, I presume?" It wasn't a question. Alexander lowered his weapon slowly. "Captain Hawkins, you found us." Yaxa bristled, but Alexander stepped in front of him. "This is Yaxa. He's the reason we have the data drive and the reason I'm still breathing. He's on our side." Hawkins's skepticism was palpable. "Is that so? And what's to stop him from putting a laser bolt in our backs the second we turn around?" "He's had plenty of chances to kill me already," Alexander said evenly, "and I've had plenty of reasons to put him down. But we're in this together now. The only way any of us are getting off this rock alive is if we trust each other." A tense beat. Then slowly Hawkins lowered her rifle. "Fine, but if your friend so much as twitches wrong—" "He won't." Alexander turned to Yaxa, meeting the Mizarian's eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. They gathered around as Alexander and Yaxa recounted their harrowing journey, from the staged crash to Razak's betrayal to the desperate battle in the bunker. Hawkins' face was unreadable as she listened, but some of her soldiers exchanged looks of disbelief, even grudging respect. The distant rattle of gunfire shattered the moment. Rebel stragglers coming their way. Hawkins snapped orders, her troops falling into formation with trained precision. Alexander and Yaxa joined them, the strange allies ready to face this new threat together. The firefight was brutal, a close-quarters melee of flashing lasers and ricocheting slugs. The humans and Yaxa fought side by side in the narrow passageways, covering each other's backs, cutting down the charging rebels with coordinated bursts of fire. Alexander lost himself in the familiar rhythm of battle, his rifle an extension of his will. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat an eternity between shots. Beside him, Yaxa fought with a savage grace, his Mizarian blaster spitting purple bolts of energy that seared through armor and bone alike. Then in a blink it was over. The last rebel crumpled, the sudden silence ringing in the aftermath. The human soldiers checked their fallen, tending to wounds, securing the perimeter. Alexander turned to Yaxa, and his blood ran cold. The Mizarian was slumped against the wall, a charred hole in his chest. One of the human soldiers lay at his feet, thrown clear of a killing shot by Yaxa's intervention. "Medic!" Alexander roared, dropping to his knees beside his fallen comrade. Yaxa's eyes flickered open, glazed with pain. "I knew you'd be trouble," the Mizarian rasped, a weak ghost of a smile on his split lips. "Should have let that rebel shoot you in the back when I had the chance." Alexander clasped his hand fiercely. "Shut up, you're going to be fine. We're getting out of here, remember?" Yaxa coughed, a wet, wrenching sound. "Not sure the universe is quite done with me yet, human. Still got a few more surprises up my sleeve." The medic arrived, field dressings and pain blockers at the ready. Alexander and Hawkins helped haul Yaxa up, supporting his weight between them as they made their way out of the bloody labyrinth of the bunker. They emerged into the mist-shrouded twilight of the whispering forests, the bulky shapes of human transport ships looming through the haze. As the ramp of the nearest one lowered, disgorging a squad of Marines to cover their extraction, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. They had survived. Against all odds, they had the data drive, and now, with the full might of the human forces behind them, they had a chance to end this war once and for all. Once aboard the transport, Alexander handed the data drive to Hawkins as Yaxa was rushed to the infirmary. She turned it over in her hands, the small device that had nearly cost them everything. "I'll get this to HQ right away," she said grimly. "If what you say is true, we don't have a moment to waste." "It's true," Alexander said with bone-deep certainty, "and it's not over yet." Hours later, as the fleet hummed with tense anticipation, awaiting orders for the final push, Alexander sat at Yaxa's bedside in the infirmary. The Mizarian was swathed in bandages, hovering on the knife's edge between life and death, but his eyes were clear as they met Alexander's. "I want to help," Yaxa said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I have to. This is my fight, too." Alexander leaned forward, torn between worry and admiration. "You've done enough, more than enough. You need to rest, to heal." But Yaxa was already shaking his head. "You don't understand. I know things that could turn the tide. Rebel bases, supply lines, command structures. I can give your people the targets they need to end this, once and for all." "And what about you?" Alexander asked softly. "This plan of yours, it'll paint a target on your back big enough to see from orbit. Your own people will never stop hunting you." "They're not my people anymore," Yaxa said with quiet conviction. "Maybe they never were, but this is a cause I'm ready to die for, if that's what it takes. A chance to make things right. To forge a real peace, not just an absence of war." "Okay," he said, the word a solemn oath. "Okay, we'll do this together. One last mission, you and me, and if we die fighting, for something worth fighting for." Yaxa's answering grip was weak, but his eyes blazed with an unquenchable fire. The fire of hope, of possibility, of a future where their worlds need not be divided by hatred and fear. The intercom crackled to life, the voice of Captain Hawkins echoing through the ship. The orders had come through. The final offensive was about to begin. Alexander and Yaxa shared a last, long look, and beneath the fear, the uncertainty, the grim spectre of their own mortality, there was something else, something that felt almost like the first, fragile stirrings of... The lightning-fast raids on rebel strongholds left Razak's forces reeling. The human Mizarian alliance's coordinated strikes cutting through their defenses like a plasma torch through steel. Alexander and Yaxa spearheaded each assault, the human's tactical prowess and the Mizarian's intimate knowledge of his people's technology proving a lethal combination. But as they stormed the command center of a key rebel base, a ghost from Yaxa's past emerged from the shadows. Dr. Zaran, his scales gleaming under the harsh lights, fixed Yaxa with a venomous glare. "Traitor!" Zaran spat, his claws clenched. "You betray your own kind to side with these primitives?" Yaxa stepped forward, his stance firm. "I'm trying to save our people, Zaran. This war will destroy us all." Zaran's eyes narrowed. "Save us? You doomed us the moment you stole that data drive." His voice lowered to a hiss. "Did you really think those plans were all it contained?" A cold dread settled in Yaxa's gut. What are you talking about? The rogue scientist's maw twisted into a vicious grin. A hidden program, designed to activate any doomsday devices already built. And I have a copy. Yaxa's blood ran cold. If Zaron was telling the truth, his actions had put not just Zephyria but countless worlds at risk. He had to get that program. Zaron's rebels surged forward, plasma rifles blazing. Alexander and Yaxa dove for cover, returning fire as they fought their way towards Zaron. The air sizzled with the heat of plasma bolts, the acrid stench of burnt flesh and ozone filling the room. Yaxa reached Zaron first, slamming into his former colleague with bone-jarring force. They tumbled to the ground, a tangle of claws and fury. "It's over, Zaron," Yaxa snarled, grappling for the data drive. "Surrender the program." But Zaron was beyond reason. With a howl of rage, he wrenched free of Yaxa's grip and lunged for a nearby console. His claws flew over the controls, inputting a rapid sequence. A deep thrumming hum filled the air. In the center of the room, a cylindrical device thrummed to life, an ominous red glow emanating from its core, the Doomsday device's prototype, powering up for detonation. "No!" Yaxa roared, tackling Zaron away from the console. They crashed to the floor, trading brutal blows as the device's whine grew to a deafening pitch. Alexander, pinned down by the remaining rebels, watched the scene with growing horror. The device's energy readings were spiking, the containment field straining. If it detonated, the entire base, along with everything for miles, would be vaporized. With a burst of desperate strength, Alexander surged from cover, laying down a withering hail of suppressing fire. The rebels scattered, their formation breaking. Alexander charged through the gap, racing for the device's control panel. His fingers danced over the alien controls, searching for the shutdown sequence. The readouts flashed red, warnings blaring. Containment failure imminent. Detonation in 15 seconds. Yaxa wrestled with Zaron, using every ounce of his strength to keep the rogue scientist away from the console. But Zaron was driven by madness and desperation, and he slowly gained the upper hand. Alexander's mind raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to shut it down, but the controls were like nothing he'd seen, the sequence eluding him. 5 seconds. In a last frantic attempt, Alexander input a string of commands, praying to any deity that would listen. The device shuddered, the hum rising to a screaming crescendo. 1. Silence. The glow faded, the device powering down with an anticlimactic whine. Alexander sagged against the console, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the room, Yaxa delivered a final crushing blow to Zaron's temple. The rogue scientist crumpled unconscious. In the sudden stillness, Alexander and Yaxa shared a look of weary triumph. They had won, if only just. Yaxa retrieved Zaron's copy of the program, ensuring it could never be used again. The prototype device was placed under guard to be disassembled and studied by the Alliance's top scientists. But even as they caught their breath, a new determination settled over them. Zaron's revelations had made one thing crystal clear. As long as any trace of the Doomsday Project remained, the galaxy was at risk. The Human-Mizarian Alliance would not rest until every last remnant was found and destroyed. As the dust settled from the battle with Zaron, Alexander and Yaxa stood over the rogue scientist's unconscious form, the weight of their victory tempered by the knowledge of the work still ahead. The Alliance forces, bolstered by their success, closed in on the last known rebel stronghold, determined to end the conflict once and for all. But as they prepared for the final assault, an unexpected communication crackled over the comm channels. The Mizarian High Command, having learned of Yaxa's pivotal role in preventing the use of the Doomsday device, extended an offer of truce. They requested a meeting to discuss the possibility of a lasting peace treaty, a chance to put an end to the bloodshed that had plagued Zephyria for so long. Alexander and Yaxa exchanged a glance, hope and trepidation warring in their eyes. After all they had been through, the prospect of peace seemed almost too good to be true. But they knew they had to try. Together with a delegation of human and Mizarian officials, they agreed to the meeting, to be held on neutral ground aboard a massive space station orbiting Zephyria. The station loomed before them as their shuttle approached, a gleaming behemoth of metal and glass against the starry backdrop of space. But as they docked and disembarked, a sense of unease settled over the delegation. The station's corridors were too quiet, too empty. Something was wrong. Their fears were confirmed as they entered the main conference room. There, waiting for them with a predatory grin, stood Razak, flanked by a group of heavily armed rebel loyalists. The scarred Mizarian leader, somehow having survived the destruction of the bunker, had seized control of the station. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Razak snarled, his eyes glinting with malice. "That we would just lay down our arms and accept your pitiful peace?" He gestured to a series of blinking devices scattered around the room, crude but undeniably threatening. "This station is rigged with enough explosives to reduce it to dust. Unless my demands are met, everyone on board will die." As the delegation reeled from this revelation, Alexander caught Yaxa's eye. A silent understanding passed between them. While the officials began to negotiate with Razak, the two slipped away, determined to locate and disarm the explosives. They moved through the station's twisting corridors, dodging rebel patrols and engaging in brief, brutal firefights when stealth failed. Yaxa's knowledge of Mizarian technology proved invaluable as they worked to neutralize each device they found. But as they delved deeper into the station's underbelly, they uncovered a darker truth. Scattered among the rebel equipment were crates bearing the markings of known arms dealers, shadowy figures who had profited from the war's prolonged misery. It became clear that Razak had not been acting alone, but had been working with these war profiteers to keep the conflict alive for their own gain. Anger and disgust fueled their efforts as they pressed on, disarming the explosives one by one. But as they approached the final device, a figure stepped from the shadows to block their path. Razak, his face twisted with hatred, lunged at them with a roar. The battle was brutal, a whirlwind of claws and fists and desperation. Razak fought with the strength of a fanatic, his blows fueled by a lifetime of rage and prejudice. Even together, Alexander and Yaxa struggled to hold their ground against his onslaught. In a moment of terrible clarity, Razak gained the upper hand. He slammed Yaxa to the ground, pinning the Mizarian beneath his bulk. His claws flexed, ready to rip out Yaxa's throat. But Alexander, moving on instinct, threw himself forward. He caught Razak's claws on his own flesh, crying out as they tore through his shoulder. Yaxa, eyes widening in shock, watched as his once enemy took the blow meant for him. Something snapped inside Yaxa at the sight of Alexander's blood. A lifetime of anger and hate fell away, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. With a surge of strength, he threw Razak off and pummeled the rebel leader with a series of devastating blows. Razak crumpled, his reign of terror ended at last. Alexander slumped against the wall, his vision dimming as blood loss took its toll. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was Yaxa's face, etched with concern and something else, something that looked almost like friendship. He woke to the steady beep of a heart monitor, his body aching but alive. Yaxa was there, keeping vigil at his bedside. The Mizarian's eyes met his, a wealth of understanding passing between them. In the days that followed, as Alexander recovered, word spread of what had transpired on the station. The human and Mizarian officials, having witnessed the bravery and sacrifice of the unlikely allies, found their own prejudices crumbling away. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk of peace. A treaty was signed, a solemn vow to end the war and begin the hard work of rebuilding. And at the forefront of this new era stood Alexander and Yaxa, no longer enemies, but partners, heroes. Months had passed since the signing of the peace treaty, but Alexander and Yaxa's work was far from over. They had been tasked with hunting down the remaining war profiteers who had fueled the conflict for their own gain. One by one, they tracked down the arms dealers and corrupt officials, bringing them to justice. But there was one name that kept eluding them, the benefactor, the mastermind behind the entire network. Intel had led them to a hidden base nestled in the asteroid belt of a nearby system. As their ship approached, Yaxa's claws tightened on the controls. "This is it," he growled. "The benefactor's stronghold." Alexander checked his weapons, a grim set to his jaw. "Let's end this." They docked with the base, exiting their ship into an eerie silence. The corridors were deserted, the only sound the hum of machinery. They moved cautiously, weapons at the ready, until they reached the heart of the facility. There, waiting for them with a cruel smile, stood Zolara. Yaxa's eyes widened in recognition. "You, but why?" Zolara laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Why, for power, of course, and profit. The war was good for business." But Zolara only smiled wider. She held up a small device, her claws hovering over the controls. "I think not. You see, I have one last card to play." The device hummed to life, a holographic display flickering into existence. Yaxa's breath caught in his throat. "Is that—" "A new doomsday weapon," Zolara confirmed. "Even more powerful than the last, and unless you let me walk out of here, I'll unleash it on both your homeworlds." Alexander and Yaxa exchanged a desperate look. They couldn't let Zolara escape, but the lives of billions hung in the balance. In that moment, Yaxa made his choice. With a roar, he charged at Zolara, slamming into her with bone-crushing force. The device flew from her hand, skittering across the floor. They grappled, claws tearing at flesh as Alexander raced for the device. But Zolara was strong, and she threw Yaxa off, lunging for the weapon herself. Yaxa intercepted her, the two Mizarians rolling across the floor in a tangle of limbs. Alexander reached the device, scooping it up with shaking hands. "Yaxa," he shouted, "I've got it." But Yaxa, locked in mortal combat with Zolara, didn't respond. With a sinking feeling, Alexander realized what his friend intended to do. And then he activated the self-destruct. Alexander screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. The explosion consumed the room, a blinding flash of light and heat. Alexander was thrown back, slamming into the wall. Alexander staggered to his feet, his ears ringing, his heart shattered. Yaxa, his unlikely friend, his brother-in-arms, had sacrificed himself to save them all. In the days that followed, the human and Mizarian governments came together to honor Yaxa's memory. A memorial was erected on Zephyria, a towering statue of a human and a Mizarian clasping hands. Yaxa's name was inscribed at the base, a symbol of the cost of peace. Alexander, though grieving, knew he had to carry on their work. He threw himself into diplomacy, working tirelessly to root out corruption and foster understanding between their peoples. The years passed, and slowly the wounds of war began to heal. But Alexander never forgot his friend or the lessons they had learned together. And so, when he stood before the next generation of human and Mizarian leaders, a new class of bright-eyed cadets, he told them the story of a war, a friendship, and a sacrifice. The story of a human and a Mizarian who had changed the course of history. "Remember this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Remember the price of peace and the power of understanding. Remember Yaxa, and honor his memory with your actions." As he looked out over the sea of faces, human and Mizarian alike, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long, the scars of war not easily erased, but with each new generation, each step towards reconciliation, they moved closer to the future Yaxa had died for. A future of peace, of unity, of hope. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.